In this video, we're going to do a kind of crash course / brief introduction into what is cross-examination and kind of what is the goal that's happening inside of any good cross-ex. So the first thing we're going to ask ourselves is, what is cross-ex? Well, cross-ex or cross-examination period are 3 minutes of dedicated time for one team to ask questions to the opposing team. There are 4 periods of cross-examination period that occur in each debate, and they always occur after a constructive. You can see on the screen there that after the 1AC, the 1NC, 2AC, and 2NC, there's 3 minutes of cross-ex time. You'll also notice that usually there is specified people who are going to ask questions there. Now, this isn't a rule as to who should ask what questions, but more of like a suggestion based upon who's going to be prepping the next speech, and therefore you don't want to interrupt their prep for the upcoming speech. So that's just kind of a guidance. There is one thing called open cross-ex, which is where all 4 people can be involved in the cross-ex at any given moment. You just have neg asking affirmative questions or affirmative asking negative questions. That's sort of something that happens in really advanced rounds and college rounds, but not something you traditionally want to do when you are first getting started in debate. Okay, so there's a meta-level purpose of cross-examination, and the first is that it increases the opportunity to establish ethos. And ethos in this context is your judge's perceived credibility of you as a debater. Should they trust the arguments that you are making? Do you sound knowledgeable? Do you know what you are talking about? So the more smart questions you can ask, the more you establish your ethos. The more smart answers you can give to the other team's questions, the more ethos you're going to have. And that can kind of sway the judge on certain issues that might be fairly tied up argumentatively and could squeak out a win for you in some really tight debates that could be happening. The other meta sort of level thing that's going to be happening is you're setting up arguments for future speeches. Remember that if you find something in cross-ex or discover something in cross-ex, you want to make sure to keep talking about it throughout the debate. Because if it is important and you just stop talking about it, then judges are going to they hate it. They hate it when people find something good to talk about in cross-ex and then never bring it up again. So if you find something, make sure to keep talking about it. And then the last sort of meta purpose for cross-examination is that it gives prep time for those who are not involved. Remember, we sort of talked about this above. You want to make sure that you use every single second of your cross-ex time so that, especially when someone's prepping. So when cross-ex of the 2AC is happening, so the 2A is getting cross-exed by the 1N, that is a valuable 3 minutes of prep time that the 2N can use for prepping their 2NC. So just in context, that 3 extra minutes, that can add up pretty easily and avoid having to kind of dip into that prep time that is ever so valuable, and you really do want to save it for the end of the debate. Okay, so what's the purpose of specific cross-ex questions? So we kind of talked the meta level, sort of why does cross-ex exist? What are we doing with it? Why is it there? But now we got to ask ourselves, what's the purpose of specific questions? So I will claim that a good question will fit into one of these 3 categories and be doing one of these 3 things inside of a debate. So a question can seek clarification, can challenge evidence, or set up future arguments. And so when you're seeking clarification, you're going to ask something that you just need to know the information for. You don't know what the answer is, but you need to understand it in order to properly understand the weakness of the argument and attack it. So a good example of this is sort of when a critique or a counterplan is run against you. You want to know what the status of the critique or the counterplan is. What does that status mean to them? And if it's a counterplan, you want to know what the net benefit is, because those are all very important things that you need to know and kind of get documented as to what the answer to those questions are, so that you know how to debate moving forward and know what arguments are kind of intimately tied to one another. And it can help you sort of pick out strategy, what needs to be answered in particular ways versus what doesn't need to be answered in particular ways, what's dangerous as an argument that can beat you versus what's not dangerous as an argument that can beat you. The second thing is to challenge evidence. We're looking at questions that can deteriorate the credit that judges give to an evidence being read. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, but really what you're trying to do is claim that a piece of evidence is not very good and the judge should not evaluate it. That's your end goal. So if it is a date contingent thing, usually these are things that are descriptions of the status quo. The status quo is in X way, or the economy is high and the status quo is a good example. The date of that evidence is really good, because if I have a piece of evidence from 1999 that indicates that the economy is good right now, well, it's a bunch of years later after that, and the things that were applying back then, i.e. Clinton being president of the United States, do not apply now. And so it is important when there are descriptions of the status quo that the date of the evidence is looked at and interrogated. Now, if you are not reading a piece of evidence that is date contingent, you need to point that out. Especially if somebody else is asking you about the date of your evidence, you need to say, listen, this is not date contingent evidence. And until you make an argument as to why the date matters, we think that this is an accurate claim about the reality of the world we live in. It is up to you to prove otherwise. There's also qualifications of the author. This is always a dicey one because you got to explain why the qualifications matter. So in a vacuum, i.e. isolated from everything else, the qualifications of an author aren't always going to be the end-all be-all. But if you've watched the How to Extend an Argument, 3 R's and a C discussion, you can know that the qualifications of an author can really be exploited when you're comparing two pieces of evidence. And you can say, this piece of evidence is from a PhD versus someone who writes for Newsweek. And then you can articulate reasons why the multiplicity of classes that had to have been taken in order to get a PhD, and the dissertation that had to be written, and the comps that had to be gone through in order for them to acquire their PhD, means that they have more understanding of the research and the nuances of that research as to why that qualification is better. Now, on the flip side, you could also make an argument as to why someone without academic qualifications would be a better qualified source because they experience the thing that is being discussed. They are a lived example of what is being discussed. And so there are lots of different ways to articulate the qualifications of the author mattering, but CrossX is a great place for you to be able to begin that discussion and send up a flare that these qualifications are going to matter as the debate continues for it. One of the things I really like to do is this next one, which is look at the ununderlined portions of cards. Debaters sometimes are a little haphazard or quick to cut a piece of evidence, and they don't always read all the ununderlined portion of the piece of evidence. And in that ununderlined portion, there will often be things that just straight contradict the claim that the team is making. And sometimes it will provide additional context to why the claim is true. And you can talk about how those conditions are no longer relevant. And therefore, the truth claim that is being made by the team is no longer relevant. And so this is a good time to start making those questions. So if the economy argument is like, with the price of oil, or with inflation being low, and that's in the ununderlined portion of the card and providing context to the claim that the author is making, you and CrossX can be like, all right, so check this out. In the ununderlined portion of this card, it talks about how inflation is being low. Do you read a piece of evidence that indicates inflation is low? Okay, how new is that piece of evidence? And so you can talk about that and really make good arguments at that particular moment about the conditions that are made. And then lastly, look at historical events. If they're making the argument that economic collapse causes global war, then you need to be like, listen, we've had the following economic collapses and recessions in the last 40 years. Why have they not resulted in global nuclear war like you are claiming? The 2008 housing crash was awful, caused a massive recession that lasted for years. Why did your impacts not get triggered during that collapse? These are really good questions because they really interrogate the validity of the claims that are being made inside of their impact evidence. And so you can really put a lot of doubt in a judge as to whether a piece of evidence is good or not doing that. And then the last thing you can kind of do is set up future arguments. You want an explanation of arguments can be used to no-link arguments, i.e. most typically, but not exclusively. You can ask questions, especially about critique alternatives, where they are going to sort of start talking about nuances, and they're going to start talking about things, trying to make it sound like they're really, really smart. But inside of those discussions of what they think is going on, you can clearly articulate that your AF is not that, or your neg is not that. This is really big in the that's not my alternative debates, or that's not my counterplan debates, where a negative team is like, your evidence indicates this, explain that to me. And in that explanation, they'll say something that the counterplan obviously is not. And that can help you set up those sort of arguments later as you go on. And so those are all sort of different ways that counterplans can help you out and make arguments, set up arguments, challenge evidence, and really get the clarification that's necessary. My favorite thing, and the thing that I always relied upon a lot, was challenging evidence, really trying to tear it down and prove that it's not relevant.